Today, 28th July, the war in Ukraine continues, and we get more reports this morning of further Russian advances in various parts of the front lines. There's confirmation, for example, of further Russian advances south of the village of Konstantinovka in southern Donetsk region. The Russians supposedly have extended their area of control south of the supply road between Konstantinovka and Vuhledar. They've already apparently cut the road in several places. And there are also reports that the Russians have actually enlarged the territory that they control in Konstantinovka itself, though there is actually very little information as to exactly what is actually going on for the moment inside Konstantinovka. Clearly, all the units from every side, the Russian and Ukrainian, and the various reporters have been told to say as little as they can about what is clearly an intense and difficult battle. And further north, in Krasnogorovka, well, the various mappers have now provided updated maps showing the situation in Krasnogorovka. This is this one remaining fortified town, still controlled by the Ukrainians west of Donetsk, or controlled by the Ukrainians, as we'll see, is now a bit of a stretch. But anyway, it's the last of the fortified towns that the Ukrainians controlled. Past tense is perhaps better, close to Donetsk city. And, well, frankly, I've seen all of the various maps. For once, they all seem to correspond, and they appear to show something like 1% of the main urban area of Krasnogorovka still controlled by the Ukrainians. This can only be a few buildings, literally, and I can't imagine that the Ukrainians are going to stay there for very much longer. To reiterate again, there's apparently two streets, not just one street, two streets, one somewhat to the north of Krasnogorovka, another immediately to the west of Krasnogorovka, with houses on either side which project westwards from the main urban area of Krasnogorovka itself. These continue to be under Ukrainian control. I can't imagine that the Ukrainians will retain control of them for much longer, by the way, not once the main part of Krasnogorovka has fallen, but obviously the Russians will want to capture these two streets before they announce the full fall of Krasnogorovka. So though it's likely that perhaps by tomorrow, all of what I used to think of Krasnogorovka will indeed be under Russian control, the Russian Defense Ministry will postpone its announcement until these two streets are captured. And there's been further news from the Donetsk area. Russians apparently are continuing to advance in this area, working towards achieving the kind of encirclement operation in Donetsk that I discussed in my previous programs. And there's reports of further Russian advances in the Siversk area. The Russians have now begun an advance from an entirely new direction in the Siversk area, somewhat to the southwest of Siversk. The military summary channel has a fairly detailed discussion of this latest advance by the Russians. The Russians are advancing on Siversk from multiple directions, from the southeast, from the southwest now, from the east itself, and from the north. All of these advances are gradual and incremental. The military summary channel has suggested that there's an intention to try to encircle Siversk, and that this latest advance is intended to cut off the main supply roads to Siversk from Slavyansk. Entirely possible. I've no reason to dispute it. As I said, it's a new battle. I'm not going to get into the details of it. All I will say is that we see the Russians advancing there as well. And we've not had news from Chasiv Yar, but I've no doubt that the fighting there is intense, and various maps all now confirm that the Russians are well embedded in areas to the west of the aqueduct, inside the main part of Chasiv Yar itself. So clearly fighting going on there. And the Russians continue to push northwards towards the village of Grigorievka, which I presume they will capture at some point within the next few days. And interestingly, there's been some interesting information from Group of Forces North about the developments in Volchansk. Now, it's not exactly clear what precisely is going on in Volchansk, but from the way in which their latest reports read, it appears that the aggregate plant has now fallen completely under their control, and they're talking about advancing their forces to the northeast of the aggregate plant in order to cut off completely the remaining Ukrainian troops from the 71st Jaeger Brigade, who are still holding out in that area of the high-rise buildings, the citadel, as some call it, in Volchansk, which the Ukrainians still control. Anyway, an encirclement operation of some sort taking place in Volchansk. The Group of Forces North acknowledge that the Ukrainians are desperate to prevent this encirclement. They're apparently trying to rush reinforcements across the Volcha River. The Russians themselves apparently have established positions well to the south of the Volcha River. This is a very complex and difficult battle. But anyway, the Russians, they've been grinding the Ukrainians in Volchansk for some time. The bombing of Volchansk has been intense and relentless, and Ukrainian losses in the area have been very high, though not so far high to the level that we saw in Bakhmut and Avdiivka. Though, of course, if the men of the 71st Jaeger Brigade are indeed encircled in the high-rise building area where they have been continuously and relentlessly bombed, well then, of course, Ukrainian losses are likely to spike. But anyway, important, interesting developments going on in that battle as well. But the big drama that is now playing out continues to be in the Pokrovsk, Avdiivka, Ocheretino area. This area where the Russians have been advancing relentlessly now for several weeks, pushing westwards, capturing village after village. There is an article today in the Washington Post which acknowledges the Russian advances in this area. It, of course, always tries to find the positive, accent the positive, but if you read the article, it struggles to do so. By the way, the British media has largely ignored these developments in the Pokrovsk, Ocheretino, Avdiivka area, even though the Russian advance in all of these places appears to be accelerating. Now, early today, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed, published statements confirming that Progress, village of Progress, and Yevgenivka have now, as the Russians like to say, been liberated. In other words, that they've been captured by the Russian military. And I've heard a further report that says that the Russian Defense Ministry is now saying that the village of Vovcha has also been captured, that the Russians are now in control of the village of Vovcha as well. Of course, we've all known this for some time. Vovcha is directly to the southwest of Progress. I'm not absolutely sure whether this is the case, and that the Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed it. I haven't found the report myself, but regardless of whether the Russian Defense Ministry has said that Volcha has fallen and that the Russians control it, I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that that is indeed the case. And I've spoken about how the Russians seem to be accelerating their advances now, and well, there's been reports that Russian forces have been pushing relentlessly, rapidly down the railway line from Progress, which leads to the village of Zelensky, and according to some reports, the Russians have now entered the cemetery area to the immediate northwest of this village, the village of Zelensky, even as they also appear to be advancing towards this village from the east, from Novoselivka Persha, which I have no doubt also that they have also captured. And interestingly, there are also reports this morning that the Russians are pushing southwest from Novoselivka Persha towards another village, a village called Mezhovye. We'll come to the importance of all of these villages shortly. And even as the Russians are pushing southwards towards Zelensky and Mezhovye, they are also apparently pushing eastwards from Progress and Volcha. And it looks as if the next village, the village of Veselye, has now been taken into a semicircle, that the Russians have taken up positions to the north, east and south of Veselye, in which case it's likely that Veselye itself will fall at some point within the next few days. All of these villages are fairly small. The military summary channel has spoken about Zelensky, and has discussed how this is a number of high-rise buildings, in other words, these apartment buildings that the Soviets used to build, solidly built and easily fortified, and in some parts of the Ukrainian battlefronts, these high-rise building areas have provided the Ukrainians with natural fortresses. We've seen this in Vuhledar, in Volchansk, in parts of Toretsk, that the high-rise building areas in Toretsk so far have been falling rather quickly. Whatever high-rise building area there is in Zelensky cannot be very extensive, because the village itself, before the war, numbered just 1,200 people. So we're probably looking at one or two isolated apartment blocks, which the Russians ought to be able to encircle and capture and bomb very quickly. This is not an easily fortified place like some of those others are. So relatively, well, a largish village, 1,200 people, but still, relatively speaking, a fairly small place overall. Now, as I said, Zelensky no doubt will be the target of the next Russian target of an attack. Veselye looks likely it's going to fall. Veselye, I ought to say, is to the south of the main road that leads from Progress to the small town of Grodivka. And of course, Grodivka is the last town on this road before you arrive in Mirnograd, which is essentially a large suburb of the town of Pokrovsk. And the other thing to say about Veselye is that it is actually to the west of the other village, to the north of this road, which is Ivanivka, which the Russians apparently have already reached, but which so far they have not yet attacked. Now, the fact that the Russians are able to attack in multiple directions, and that they're using armor to do so, tells us that they are here in this area in substantial number. I'm not going to try to guess how large the Russian forces are, but we must be looking at 10, 20,000 men, at least something on that kind of ballpark number, even allowing for the fact that, we're probably not looking at the movement of vast armies, but we're looking at an advance by a substantial force, which it is clear is a lot more powerful than anything that the Ukrainians can deploy in order to stop it. And let's now return to the topic of the villages of Zelensky and Mezhovye, south and east of Progress and Volchansk and Yevgenivka, these villages that the Russian Defense Ministry tell us that the Russians control. And, well, in order to understand their potential importance, and, bear in mind, I'm not the person perhaps to go to for a complete understanding of these things, but in order to understand their potential importance, I think it is useful to expand the map a little, and what becomes immediately clear is that Zelensky and Mezhovye and all of these places, if the Russians capture them, and if they capture various other villages in this area, small villages, Komishevka, Ptiche, Novozelanye, Zavitne, Mykolaievka, Marinivka, Sergeyevka. Anyway, if the Russians capture all of these villages, then they're in a position to cut the main road from Selidovo to Karlovka, a village which the Russians have been gradually advancing through. It is another village located well to the south along the main road. It's fairly well protected by various water barriers. But the point is, if the Russians are able to cut the road from Selidovo to Karlovka, the Ukrainians will have to pull back from Karlovka. But importantly, Selidovo itself becomes a potential target. It doesn't take much to see that the distance between these villages, Zelensky, Mezhovye, and others, and of course Karlovka itself, and Selidovo, is not that big. Now, Selidovo is another one of these logistic bases which the Ukrainians created in this area of the battlefronts. And if Selidovo falls, then this will put the supply situation for the Ukrainian troops in the southwestern part of the battlefronts, in places like Kurachovo, and ultimately Vuhledar itself, and Krasnogorovka, to the extent that they're still fighting in Krasnogorovka. It will put the Ukrainians in this area in great jeopardy. Now, there was a most interesting discussion of all of these battles in Redovka yesterday. Redovka, to reiterate, is this Russian newspaper based in Smolensk. It provides very detailed accounts of the fighting alongside lots and lots of other news. It covers all the range of Russian political, economic, and social news, and by the way, an awful lot of gossip as well. So it's a fairly sophisticated tabloid-type newspaper, but it does have some very strong contacts with the military. It appears to have some very intelligent commentators and reporters, and every evening it provides an overview of the state of the battle. And the last one that they provided was most interesting because they highlighted what they say is the importance of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk, according to them, and this is Redovka, is in fact the hinge town. It is the part of the town that holds together the entire Ukrainian front line positions in Donbass. If the Ukrainians lose Pokrovsk, their entire supply system collapses. All of the various roads and railway lines that connect the Ukrainian forces in Donetsk will break down. And at that point, we're looking at, in effect, a splitting of the Ukrainian positions in eastern Ukraine. The areas to the east of Pokrovsk and the areas to the south of Pokrovsk are divided from each other. So according to Redovka, Pokrovsk is the hinge. Its loss would be a disaster for Ukraine, not just in supply terms and logistic terms, but also in terms of the coherence and of their defense lines. Well, that's what Redovka says. To reiterate again, these Russian advances in the Pokrovsk, Selidovo, Avdiivka or Cheretino area are not the only places where the Russians continue to advance. The Ukrainians carried out some kind of a counterattack in the Zaporozhye area near to Rabotino and Verbovoye. It's been suggested that this was basically a probing attack in anticipation of a major Russian offensive which may be taking place there. Perhaps that's true. Who knows? But whatever, lots of things are happening across the battlefronts. But the overall picture is clear. The battle is swinging badly against Ukraine. And to reiterate once more, there doesn't seem to be anything very much that the West can do to turn the situation around. In fact, I'm going to go further. I'm going to say that there is nothing that the West can do to turn the situation around. There are not enough air defense missiles, not enough shells, not enough tanks. I'm going to say this. I'm having even more doubts about the ideas that some are suggesting that Western air forces might be in a position to change the picture decisively on the battlefronts in Ukraine, even if they were committed. I say that with a full understanding and knowledge that were such a thing to happen, we would be in a disastrous crisis, one which would bring us very close to World War III. But suffice to say, I've now watched programs involving serving officers, or at least recently serving officers of the Swedish Air Force. For example, I read an article today in the Daily Telegraph, all of which cast into doubt the ability, or rather the potency, of Western air forces in a head-to-head clash with the Russians. Swedish officers seem to be skeptical, for example, about the advantages of stealth. He actually expressed his views at some considerable length in a YouTube program, which I saw. And he made it fairly clear that he thinks that the days of stealth offering any major advantage have long since passed, and that technological developments across the air defense world have now rendered stealth, if not fully obsolete, at any rate much less effective than they used to be. He also, by the way, was doubtful, skeptical about the effectiveness of the F-35, the lead stealth fighter now, as I understand it, in the US Air Force, in air-to-air combat, quite apart from his many other stated problems that people talk about. He thought that the F-35 simply doesn't carry enough missiles in order to engage in effective air combat, and he appeared to think of it mostly as a strike aircraft. There's an article, by the way, today in the Daily Telegraph, which is also appears to be somewhat sceptical of the F-35 and suggests that the incoming Labour government in Britain might be actually intending to scrap the F-35s, the fleet of F-35s that currently equip Britain's two aircraft carriers. What then happens to the aircraft carriers? I have absolutely no idea, by the way. But anyway, I'm not going to go into the details of all of this. All I would say is that there is nothing realistically that can be done to change the overall military situation, at least not for the moment, not in any way that would not risk an all-out nuclear war between the West and Russia. And I get the sense that Western governments, for the moment at least, are not prepared to go there. There was an interesting article in the British media, I think it was in the London Times, that discussed, for example, the tangled question, constantly brought up by all sorts of commentators, both in Europe and in the United States, about authorizing or green-lighting Ukrainian attacks with long-range missiles deep inside Russia. And it suggested that there's been intense argument and discussion on this topic within the British government. Well, they didn't quite say that, but that was certainly the impression I got from reading the article. But the consensus, the view in the end, has come down against the idea because of the danger that the Russians would actually follow through on their warning, the warning that they gave to the British ambassador a couple of weeks ago when this idea was first floated by David Cameron, that the Russians might retaliate by launching missile strikes against British assets around the world, even in Britain itself. And apparently various other European governments, one suspects the German government, for example, are also very nervous of testing Russian resolve on this question. And for that reason, despite, again, lots of argument and internal discussion about it, this idea, for the moment, has been put to one side. The Ukrainians, apparently, are deeply frustrated and baffled as to why the West supposedly has called a stop on this idea. But in fact, it's not very difficult to see why. And by the way, and going back to comments that have been recently made by Daniel Davis, it's impossible to see how even these kind of strikes, if they were permitted, would in and of themselves radically change the military situation in Ukraine. Briefly, the Russians have more of everything. They have more of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, shells, artillery pieces, drones. They're moving ahead. They're becoming more advanced in drones. They're probably overtaking the Ukrainians in that area as well. Air defense systems, aircraft, and realistically, nothing is going to happen to change that. And of course, in manpower terms, the difference is now stark and is becoming more lopsided by the day. So, an urgent moment for negotiations, one might assume. In Britain, as the historian Jeff Roberts has informed me, the British historian and peer, Lord Robert Skidelsky, has just made a speech to the House of Lords, one of the two houses of the British Parliament, also urging negotiations, trying to get the British government to think outside its box and to try to urge Ukraine and other countries, and itself, of course, to embrace the idea of negotiations. And, well, I've discussed in recent programs how the Ukrainians, to quote again that comment made to me by Sofia Midkiff, seem to intellectually understand that the war is lost, but emotionally are incapable of accepting it. So they have been reaching out to the Vatican, to China, and they've now apparently invited Prime Minister Modi of India to come to Kiev, and the word is that he's actually on his way and will be there in about 2 weeks' time. Problem is that the Ukrainians, as I discussed in my program yesterday, show no real indication, no real sign that they are prepared for negotiations. And to see how this is so, just look at the latest comments that Zelensky himself has made in an interview he has given with Japanese television. He has said that I have set this task, which is to draw together a plan for peace by the end of November. I set this task before my administration and our diplomatic team. I think the plan will be ready by the end of November. And over the course of this interview with Japanese television, Zelensky then said that he was confident that strengthening the Ukrainian army, support from the US and other countries, and international diplomatic pressure on Russia are, to quote him, the three components that will bring the war to a just end. And he then admitted that he had received informal proposals to freeze the conflict. One wonders from whom, by the way. Perhaps he's referring here to Viktor Orban. But he had rejected them. He said that the centerpiece of his new plan will be the issue of Ukraine's territorial integrity, and this topic is the one that he's going to discuss with various countries, including presumably Prime Minister Modi, when he arrives in Kiev. Now, that makes it look to me as if his new peace plan is exactly the same as his old peace plan. Essentially, the Russians capitulate. They agree that all the territory of Ukraine that Ukraine controlled before February 2014, including Crimea, should come once again under Ukrainian control, that the Russians pull out, and then after the Russians have in effect capitulated, there might be some kind of discussions, though it's never clear exactly what those negotiations or discussions are going to be about. But from time to time, Ukrainian spokesmen have talked about the Russians agreeing to pay the cost to repair all the damage that Ukraine has suffered as a result of the war. In other words, the scale of reparation payments, the terms upon which Russian leaders are to be tried for their war crimes, that kind of thing. This is fantastic thinking. And if this is what Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, went with on his trip to China, where he just met with the Chinese foreign minister, Wang Yi, well, it's unsurprising that the Chinese government apparently was deeply unimpressed. I say that because the Chinese have actually been unusually reticent as to what exactly it was that they discussed with Kuleba. I understand that there is a Chinese readout, but they've never translated it, as far as I can see, into English. And, well, by all accounts, from every account that I've read, it looks as if the Chinese really didn't take very well to whatever it was that Kuleba came with. We've had some comments, public comments, from Wang Yi about what has happened, what the state of the negotiations is with respect to the conflict in Ukraine. But interestingly, what the Chinese readout has not, the Chinese readout where we get these comments is not the readout in English of Wang Yi's meeting with Kuleba. It is a readout of a meeting that Wang Yi has just had with US Secretary of State Tony Blinken. And it was a fairly tough, irritable Wang Yi, I would almost say exasperated Wang Yi, who addressed Tony Blinken on all sorts of issues, including Taiwan, by the way, and on Ukraine. Wang Yi said this. I'm taking this from the Chinese readout. China's position on the Ukraine issue is fair and transparent, and China will continue to encourage and promote peace talks. The United States should stop abusing unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction. China rejects false accusations and will not succumb to pressure or blackmail. China will take resolute and robust measures to protect its major interests and legitimate rights. So that was basically the Chinese telling the Americans, look, we're not going to be deterred or intimidated or put out in any way by what you tell us with your threats about imposing secondary sanctions on our banks. We reject those entirely. Our general stance has not changed. But importantly, the key thing to take away from that is that there is no reference there to Kuleba's visit to Beijing. If the visit had gone well, if there'd been serious proposals from the Ukrainians, then I can't imagine that the Chinese, Wang Yi, would not have discussed those with Tony Blinken and would not be telling Tony Blinken that China is now confident that negotiations are about to get underway. So all of the signs are that the Chinese are deeply frustrated by Kuleba. And I'm going to predict that behind all the smiles and the polite words, in fact the friendly words, Modi is going to come away from Kiev every bit as frustrated and as exasperated with the Ukrainians as the Chinese currently are. On that topic, by the way, I ought to say that the Chinese and the Indians are now in what look like very serious high-level discussions with each other with a view to trying to move forward to sort out their problems. It's been hugely underreported, but on 25th July, in other words, just 3 days ago, Wang Yi and Jaishankar, the Indian foreign minister, met in Laos and had what appears to have been a very, very detailed and comprehensive discussion in which they agreed apparently to engage in concerted efforts to maintain peace and tranquility in border areas and work for new progress in consultations on border affairs and look for some means to try to solidify and improve their relations. I'm going to quote the Chinese readout, but there's doubtless an equally informative Indian one. But the Chinese say that Jaishankar said that India and China are two countries with the largest populations and two major economies and ancient civilizations with long histories. Maintaining stable and predictable development of bilateral relations is entirely in the interests of the two sides and holds special significance for upholding regional peace and promoting multipolarity. Notice that's the Indian Foreign Minister talking about the need to promote multipolarity. In other words, to move away from the situation where the dominant power is the United States. And then the Chinese then quote Jaishankar as saying, India and China have broad converging interests and face the shadow brought by the situation in the border areas, but the Indian side is ready to take a historic, strategic and open perspective, define solutions to the differences and get the relations back to a positive and constructive track. I remember some months ago, Professor Jeffrey Sachs said on one of the superb programs that he does for us on the Durand, for which we are most grateful to him, by the way. Anyway, Professor Sachs said that he anticipated that at some point over the next couple of months, maybe now in fact, the Chinese and the Indians would start making serious efforts to improve their relations. The Indian elections are out of the way. A new coalition government has been formed, and it looks to me as if that is exactly what is happening. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss this further in this program. Just to repeat again that Zelensky's peace plan, his new peace plan, appears to be identical to the old peace plan, and it seems to me that it really isn't going to take the situation forward in any conceivable way. And going back to the points which I've been making in earlier programs, the reason why the Ukrainians are going from country to country, trying to get the Chinese, the Indians, the Saudis, the Vatican, to try to come on side with them, try to get some kind of negotiations going, but strictly on Ukrainian terms, is because the Ukrainians understand that they're losing the war. And what they basically want is to freeze the situation in order to buy themselves time, or if not freeze the situation, at least reduce the intensity of the fighting in Ukraine in order to buy themselves time to reorganize and re-equip, to receive the F-16s, such help as they will provide, to get the additional Patriot missile systems that they've been promised, to try to rebuild their army, to try to stabilize the front lines, to, in other words, buy themselves a respite so that they continue with the same maximalist objectives that they have always had. And I've received a fascinating email from a source, somebody who is very attuned to thinking on both the Russian and Western side, and who has in the past provided me with very interesting information about the kind of discussions that take place in Russia, in the parliament in Russia in particular. And this person said that the Russians are very deeply suspicious of all of these Ukrainian moves. They see them exactly, as I've discussed, as an attempt to buy time, not as a serious effort to engage in real negotiations, and that the Russians are not going to let themselves be caught in the same way again. The same source said, and about this I have no doubt that he is right, that the Russians have no expectations at all of any shift of policy in the event that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are elected president and vice president in November. They are, of course, very well aware of what Trump and especially Vance have been saying. But again, they've been caught out on this before. They've assumed that negotiating over the Ukraine with Western partners, with the Germans and the French, and indeed at times with the Americans, it's often forgotten that back in 2014, Lavrov had a whole succession of meetings with the then Secretary of State, John Kerry, that they even at one point appeared to agree with each other on the need for a ceasefire and for Ukraine to move towards a more federalist structure. There was a whole summit meeting between Lavrov and Kerry in London, and it came out with a communique that said all of those things. I remember discussing it at the time in various articles, and I believe even in one or two interviews that I may have given at that time. And of course, that discussion, which did cause the Russians perhaps to modify their policies in 2014, this was very, very shortly after the Maidan events. Anyway, suffice to say that it ended up leading nowhere at all. That communique has disappeared into a memory hole. Nobody ever mentions it. Nobody ever talks about it. As far as most people in the West are concerned, that summit meeting between Lavrov and Kerry never took place. So the Russians have no expectations of any change in policy in the United States. And by the way, something that's just happened in the United States on the Republican side will have solidified their skepticism of any change in American policy. Because Donald Trump's former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who was also at one time Donald Trump's CIA director, anyway, he's now come up with what he says is a peace plan for a future Trump administration. And essentially what it sets out is a plan which is, in essence, not so very different in the end from the Zelensky plan or from all the other plans that we've seen. A cessation of the fighting, a ceasefire, but not an armistice, a demand from the Russians that they agree to this, a warning that if they don't, the United States will supply Ukraine with $500 billion of military aid through a Lend-Lease system. That has already been attempted, by the way, and it has already completely failed. Congress, as I remember, passed some kind of Lend-Lease provisions for Ukraine back in 2022, and we've not heard anything about that since. Ukraine, by the way, for the record, even after negotiating a haircut with its creditors, has now been put in a position of essential default. One of the credit rating agencies, I believe it was Fitch, has now lowered its credit rating to C, which is basically a default position. So, nonetheless, Mike Pompeo says that this country, which is in default, should receive $500 billion of aid from the United States through some kind of Lend-Lease arrangement, which would in theory require Ukraine to pay the United States for the aid that it's receiving. How can a bankrupt country pay anything? Ultimately, it will be, of course, the American taxpayer that foots the bill. That's what would happen. But anyway, $500 billion of aid to Ukraine, permission to Ukraine to use the weapons the United States provides in a completely unrestricted way, launch missile and bomb attacks on Moscow or do whatever it wants with all the missiles and weapons. Well, that's apparently Pompeo's plan, and I think it's absolute nonsense myself. I think it's completely unworkable, but it is also insanely escalatory. And of course, the Russians are aware of it. They're well aware of the fact that Pompeo was the Secretary of State previously under Donald Trump. They remember Pompeo very well and are also aware that Pompeo still has a connection to Donald Trump. So all of that is going to make them deeply suspicious going forward. Negotiations can certainly happen, and so they should, just as Lord Skidelsky says. But the only basis upon which they can happen, the only basis upon which there can be a ceasefire, is first, if you want negotiations, but you don't want to make any significant withdrawals from the battlefronts, well, in that case, without a ceasefire, as happened in the negotiations between the Americans and the North Vietnamese in the 1960s, late 1960s and 1970s. Negotiations can still take place. They can take place in some foreign capital, in Delhi maybe, just saying, or Ankara, or wherever, but the fighting continues and the Russians continue to advance. That's one option. Or alternatively, the Ukrainians can finally do that which Putin told them to do, which is to pull out completely all their troops from the four regions and accept that the city of Zaporozhye itself one of the big cities in Ukraine, must be handed over in its entirety to the Russians. Now, that's the reality. It's the reality that people in Ukraine, obviously, but people in the West, it seems to me, continue to resist. But the reality also is that if this is not done, if we don't proceed on that basis, then the war will go on, and we've seen that the Russians are getting closer every day now to Pokrovsk. Julian Röpke put them 14 kilometers from Mirnograd. Others are saying that they're now just 17 kilometers from Pokrovsk itself. I'm not going to try and work out the distances. I'm not able to do that on a map. Map reading is an ordeal for me, to put it mildly. I don't know how far the Russians are from Selidovo and all of these other places, but the fact is they're getting closer all the time, and the Ukrainians don't seem to be able to resist them. And if Pokrovsk is indeed captured by the Russians, and the consequences are indeed as grave as as Rydovka says, well, it would be obviously the beginning of the end of the war. By the way, the commentator, the person who wrote to me, this is most interesting email, also said that the Russians sense that the Ukrainians understand that the direction of events at the moment is making it not just impossible for the Ukrainians to defend their positions in eastern Ukraine, east of the Dnieper, but that it's looking increasingly difficult for the Ukrainians to organize an orderly retreat of their army from its positions east of the Dnieper. That the way things stand at the moment, if such an attempt were made, most of the army, much of the Ukrainian army, would rapidly found itself surrounded by the Russians, and that some large-scale capitulation of Ukrainian forces east of the Dnieper might take place. So, for that reason as well, because the Ukrainians are starting to understand not only that they're going to lose all of the territory east of the Dnieper, but that they risk losing the better part of their army east of the Dnieper as well. putting their entire ability to continue to defend themselves west of the Dnieper, beyond doubt. That is another reason why they're looking for some kind of pause in the fighting at this time. But to repeat again, they're not prepared for the moment to make the concessions to reality that the situation demands of them. And of course, neither does the West. We all continue to sleepwalk towards a disastrous defeat in Ukraine. You get the odd article here and there that highlights how bad the situation has become. But as that article in Politico that I discussed a few days ago said, most of the time, Western leaders continue to repeat the same old cliches about supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, about Ukraine's irreversible path towards NATO, all of those things. In fact, we had another example, to my mind, of the inability of many people to face reality in the West, in the form of a letter that appeared signed by an almost unending number of people, various academics mostly, in various institutions, basically saying that Ukraine should be admitted to NATO and admitted pretty much right away, that there is no need for the West to fear that admitting Ukraine into NATO would have any negative consequences, and showing, again, a complete inability, an absolute refusal to acknowledge the actual battlefield realities that are playing out in Ukraine at this time. So there we are. We're sleepwalking towards disaster. In Ukraine, I think there are all sorts of people in the militaries in the West. I suspect there are various people in the civil service institutions and the foreign ministries, even in the intelligence agencies, who understand how bad the situation actually is. But for the moment, certainly this side of the American election, there is no one who is prepared to grasp the nettle and accept that the situation is rapidly spiraling out of control and that a Ukrainian defeat is coming. This is true in Kiev, it is true in the chancelleries of Europe, and it is true in what passes for the government of the United States. Now, on the topic of the United States, we are going through that period at the moment when the media is very excited about Kamala Harris. There's been clearly a huge attempt to mobilize support for her and to persuade the American people that she truly is an outstanding candidate. All the doubts that we've heard about Kamala Harris, not just for weeks, but in fact for years, they've all been stilled. We're told that she really is, the second coming of Barack Obama or something even greater. And there's also been, I've noticed, a rather unconvincing, at least in my mind, attack on J.D. Vance. There was a rather negative article about him, for example, in the Financial Times, but there's been various attacks about him, dredging up comments that he's made about various things from several years ago, never, I notice, addressing the social and economic issues, especially the economic and foreign policy issues, where he is making his most original and ultimately most important points. But anyway, put all that aside, I've discussed how the Biden administration, such as it is caught like a rabbit in the headlights of the oncoming car as the disaster in Ukraine looms ever closer. The same can be said, in my opinion, about the situation in the Middle East. Now, the first thing to say is that there was an attack some days ago, a missile strike, presumably by Hezbollah, the Lebanese militia, on a settlement in the Golan Heights. Tragically, a number of children were killed. I've seen reports that suggest that 12 children were killed. And entirely unsurprisingly, no one should be surprised in light of the things that Prime Minister Netanyahu was saying over the course of his trip to Washington. Anyway, entirely unsurprisingly, the Israeli government is now apparently cranking up for the attack on Hezbollah in Lebanon, which the Israeli military appears to be so unhappy and skeptical about. So we are on the brink of another major expansion of the war. Now, the attack, the missile strike on the settlement in the Golan Heights, I'm not going to discuss in this program. I don't know the details of it. I don't know what the Hezbollah fighters who launched the missile thought they were attacking. I doubt that they intended to kill children. I don't see why they would want to commit a war crime and an atrocity like that. But one way or the other, it's provided the pretext that some people, it seems to me, have been yearning for in Israel and to some extent the United States as well, to start a war, which I suspect many people within the Biden administration and within the Israeli army have been hoping desperately to avoid. And of course, what is going to happen if this battle with Hezbollah begins is that we're going to have exactly the same situation that played out after the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October. Great deal of sympathy for Israel initially in the immediate aftermath of the attack. After all, civilians were killed and civilians were taken captive by Hamas and held as hostages, something which, as the various courts, the ICJ and especially the ICC, have pointed out, is a war crime. So there was a revulsion of feeling against Hamas, but of course all of that was quickly overtaken by a revulsion of feeling against Israel itself because of the scale and disproportionate ferocity of the Israeli response. And I'm going to suggest exactly the same thing is going to happen if Israel launches an attack on Hezbollah in Lebanon. We're going to have another situation where the Israeli army is going to be fighting a militia, this time a much more well-armed and experienced militia, operating from fortified positions with far more powerful equipment and secure supply lines to Iran, which is its main sponsor. So there's going to be a very, very tough battle, much tougher, I suspect, than the one in Gaza. And of course, inevitably, Israel will rely on its air force, which is its primary strategic military asset. And that will mean heavy bombing of Lebanese communities in southern and central Lebanon, perhaps also in the capital, Beirut. Inevitably, civilians will die and start to die in large numbers. We've seen that the Israeli Air Force seems to have no ability or perhaps desire to limit civilian casualties. And the revulsion that some I feel, at the moment, connected to this attack on the settlement in Gaza is going to change into a much more powerful revulsion against Israel, further isolating Israel, causing further embarrassment to the United States at a time when the Biden administration is itself disorganized and in chaos, and where there is a major split within the Democratic Party on this issue. I think, again, there is still a degree of inability on the part of people in the West, some people in the West, to understand the extent to which feeling internationally, globally, is swinging against the West on the Israel-Palestine Middle East crisis. Now, over the last couple of hours, I've finally got round to reading the 98-page judgment of the International Court of Justice. I call it a judgment, though it is technically an advisory opinion, and though it is not a judgment, so it doesn't actually make any orders of Israel, it nonetheless ought to be seen as an authoritative statement of international law. And this decision, this advisory opinion, relates to Israeli settlement policy in the West Bank, but also, by the way, in Gaza itself, and it touches on the situation in Gaza. Now, I said it's a 98-page opinion. One of the things that was interesting about it for me is that though it was very authoritative and very clear, it felt little need to discuss authorities, the many authorities that it cites, legal authorities that it cites, in any detail, not because the time was not there and the authorities are not there, but because many of the legal points it was making from the point of view of international war crimes and humanitarian law are all commonplaces. And this advisory opinion was scathing. It made it absolutely clear that the entire settlement policy that Israel has been conducting is illegal and has been illegal from the outset. It sets out in detail the various subsidiary laws, provisions that Israel has been violating on discrimination, on humanitarian law, on all kinds of things of this kind. It talks about Israeli policy being, in effect, a policy of annexation. It talks about illegal confiscations of property, oppression, things of that kind. Now, of course, a lot of this has been said about Israeli policy in the Palestinian territories for decades. There's nothing new about this here. But the fact is, we've now reached the point where the International Court of Justice is coming out and giving advisory opinions about it, setting out in exhaustive detail the extent to which what Israel is doing is contrary to international law, in the most fundamental ways. And that reflects global attitudes. If anybody has worked inside a court, as I have done, they can confirm one thing, which is that law is not a complete, exact science. It eventually, gradually follows where opinion, national in terms of national courts, global in terms of world courts, where that leads. And it's clear that the International Court of Justice is now increasingly following the lead, no longer of Western governments, in the days of Western paramountcy, a decision of this kind would not have happened. It's following the lead of the BRIC states, of the global majority, whatever you want to call it. Now, it should be said the advisory opinion is not unanimous, but in the most important provision, there was only one dissenting judge, the same judge who has spoken out on behalf of Israel in every single hearing up to this time, and who is, as far as I can see, increasingly isolated on the bench. On other rulings, there were more judges, some more judges joined her, but overall, there was a clear majority of the court that endorsed the advisory opinion in its entirety. So there we are. And if fighting on the part of Hezbollah begins, well, we're likely to see this global majority crystallize and harden its stance still further, and the West become isolated still more. And the further point to make, specifically about the International Court of Justice, is that reading this advisory opinion, reading the views and direction that the International Court of Justice is taking, and it's important to remember this is a court that is part of the United Nations system and is the oldest and most prestigious of all international courts. I have to say that I think it is now almost inevitable, in fact, essentially inevitable, that at some point over the next few years, perhaps even months, the International Court of Justice is going to find Israel in breach of the genocide statute. That case is still moving forward, but a judgment, a very strong judgment against Israel in connection with the events in Gaza is now, I think, all but certain to come. Now, the other court, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has been much more dithery, as one might expect. It's not so much doesn't have anything like the prestige and authority and jurisprudence and history that the International Court of Justice does. It is continuing, by the way, to issue all kinds of indictments against all sorts of Russian officials, including the overall military commander, Russian military commander of the Russian forces involved in the special military operation, General Gerasimov. But in addition to all of that, the ICC has of course received a request from its chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, for arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant. Netanyahu is furious about this, and much of his speech to Congress the other day was on this very topic. Now, again, a sign of the enormous pressures that Western governments are starting to come under has been provided by a recent action of the British government. Britain had attempted to persuade the ICC to reject the request from its prosecutor for arrest warrants to be issued against Netanyahu and Gallant. They wanted the ICC to revisit the question of the ICC's jurisdiction to issue such warrants against Israel. And that was, of course, a controversial position in Britain itself. I understand Germany supported Britain's move, and the judges of the ICC postponed their decision to issue warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant in response to these British moves? Well, the British government, the new Labour government, mindful of the unrest of some of its members, including some of its MPs, particularly those who represent constituencies with large Muslim populations. Anyway, the British government has now abandoned this attempt. It's given up this attempt. It's basically telling the ICC, just go ahead and issue the warrants. This despite the fact that I think Prime Minister Starmer remains as unhappy with the issue of warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant as his predecessor, Rishi Sunak, was. But the politics of it are making it impossible for the British government to hold the line. So it is now more likely that the warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant will be issued. And once those warrants are issued, it's highly likely that the ICC will move on and will issue more warrants against other Israeli officials as well. To my mind, this whole affair is a further sign of the extent to which Western governments are losing control of the international legal process as they become increasingly isolated in world affairs. And, well, they've just been warned about this very thing by the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, in connection with the Ukraine issue. He has just made further comments to his European partners. Hungary is, of course, still a member of the EU. He's trying to explain to the other European leaders that world opinion outside the West is now swinging decisively against Russia. He's made the point that all the big countries outside the West, China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, I'm not sure which countries he mentioned, but all of them are increasingly coming round to accepting the Russian point of view about the Ukraine war. That was what the recent peace conference in Switzerland showed. That is the reality that President Zelensky and his government refuse to accept. And it is the reality that the Europeans and the Biden administration also refuse to accept. It looks to me as if the war is going to grind on. I can't see that the Russians are going to slow down. Why would they slow down? I doubt that negotiations in any meaningful sense are going to get underway. I can't see that the Russians, the Russians are obviously not going to agree to the proposals that the Ukrainians are making, and they're definitely not going to accept a ceasefire on the basis of Ukraine's existing proposals, which, as I said, are the same as Ukraine's previous proposals. So the war is going to grind on, and when the defeat comes, the West is going to find not only that the Russians have won, but that most of the world is supporting them. How the West is going to react to that, how Western governments will feel when they turn up, their officials turn up in Brasilia and Delhi and Jakarta and other places, Riyadh, Cairo, and find that nobody there agrees with them. And most of the governments of the countries in all of these capitals that I've just mentioned feel that the West has basically brought its defeat down upon itself. How Western governments are going to react, I'm not going to even try to guess. But that's where we're going. That's where events are heading. I see no sign of any change, at least for the time being. Even if Vance and Trump really do want to change direction, that can't happen before January anyway. And in the meantime, of course, the Russians remain unconvinced. Well, this is where I finish my program today. There'll be more from me soon, tomorrow. I'm going to revisit, by the way, when I speak tomorrow, the issue of Nabulina's, the Russian central bank's decision to increase interest rates. I've had an awful lot of comments about this, many more than I expected, by the way. Both critical of Nabulina and supportive of her and all kinds of things. So I'm going to revisit that topic briefly in my program tomorrow, but this is where I finish today. So let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget that you can check out our shop, get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you like this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.